Roy Rogers' daughter shares how her dad really was. Roy Rogers did a lot of great things and left a lot of great things behind. As a child, the famous actor and cowboy had a lot of skills. His upbeat attitude and sense of humor changed the entertainment business forever. The funny, likable cowboy was in over 100 movies and TV shows, including The Roy Rogers Show, Sons of the Pioneers, and even Wonder Woman. He had a life full of exciting adventures and big goals. Roy Rogers was known as the King of the Cowboys for a reason. He kept going through good times and bad. No matter what life threw at him, he always got back on his horse with a smile and all the strength in the world. Hold on tight because we're about to hear about Roy Rogers' exciting and goal-oriented life as told by his children. The Ohio native. Leonard Franklin Sly was Roy Rogers' name when he was born on November 5, 1911. Maddie and Andrew Sly, his parents, were born and raised in Cincinnati. The family lived in a rent-controlled apartment building, which is now the site of the Riverfront Stadium. Rogers joked that he was born at second base a lot of the time. For a few more years, the family stayed in the Midwest. Then they thought it was time to move on and try to make their life better. Life on the road. People today think of Rogers as one of the best singers and artists of the 20th century. Sly was the king of the cowboys and the face of Hollywood in the 1930s before he became Roy Rogers. He lived on the road. His family moved west after leaving Ohio. Andy, his dad, and Will, his uncle, came up with the brilliant idea of making a sailboat out of scrap wood and logs. The houseboat wasn't fancy, but it was their home for a while, and they sailed down the Ohio River to Portsmouth. Time for change. The Sly family hasn't been to Portsmouth in a while. Not everything was easy, though, and the family chose to make another change. They bought a farm 12 miles outside of Portsmouth in 1919 with the hope of making it their permanent home. Since Rogers was a child and lived on a farm, he could have seen and been close to many interesting animals. He turned into the cowboy we all know and love because of this. But there was another big change in the family. Life on the farm. The family found that life on the farm was a lot harder than they thought it would be. The house wasn't making enough money to pay for itself, so Rogers' dad, Andy, had to get a second job to make ends meet. He chose to work during the week at a Portsmouth shoe shop. Andy had to work in the city 5 days a week for this job and only got to go home on weekends. The family had a hard time, but Andy was able to give them everything they wanted. Rogers' life would never be the same after receiving one gift. The best gift ever. The family had a hard time living apart, especially Rogers, who needed a father role when he was young. The Slys tried their best to enjoy their time together, though. Andy could buy them gifts because his second job paid well. One of these gifts was the best present ever for the man who would become king of the cowboys. Andy came home with a beautiful horse after a hard week of work. The farm gave the animal a lot of space, and Rogers fell in love with it right away. He learned how to ride when he was young and used those skills when he took over Hollywood with Trigger the horse, who was his co-star. Spending time with family. Rogers began riding horses when he was only 10 years old. At this point, it was clear that he was interested in and loved these beautiful animals. The family had to find other things to do besides horseback riding to pass the time. In those days, there was no radio or any other kind of entertainment. Instead, the family spent the weekends singing, dancing, and playing music. When Andy got home from work on the weekends, his family had friends over and everyone had a good time. Center of attention. When these groups got together, Rogers showed off another skill. He loved putting on shows and making people laugh. He sang and yodeled while playing his mandolin, even though he was still a child. He would even get up front and square dance with his family, friends, and other people who lived nearby. Rogers was headed for fame because he was good at riding horses and loved being the center of attention. There were happy times, but there would soon be over because the family had to move back to Cincinnati. Dropping out. Rogers and his family went through a lot of big changes very quickly. Without a question, it was hard, but it also brought the family closer together than ever. Rogers used to play the banjo, sing, and dance for his family's entertainment when he was a child. But when he was a teenager, everything changed. He went to Ohio's McDermott High School until he thought it would be best for him to drop out and get a job to help his family make more money. It was a brave and important thing for a teenager to do. Attending night school. Rogers didn't want to forget about school, even though he dropped out of high school. His real goal was to become a doctor, so going to school was very important to him. He couldn't go to school every day and take care of his family at the same time, so he found another way to learn. He worked with his dad Andy at a nearby shoe plant during the day and went to night school at night. He would soon learn, though, that this was too much for a youth to handle. Too much to bear. Rogers was determined at first to finish school and get a license. He worked long shifts at a shoe factory, though, and was so tired that he fell asleep in class one night. Some people at night school made fun of him, which was too much for Rogers, who was only young. He stopped going to school for good and never came back. Luckily for him, it was a time of plenty in the United States, and his life led him to a job that didn't require a degree at all. A trip to California. Rogers was born in the Midwest and spent his childhood traveling all over Ohio. He even started crossing state lines as an adult to look around and maybe get a better job. However, Ohio is very far from Hollywood. So how did Rogers get to California in the early 1920s? It all began with his older sister Mary, who married and moved to California. Rogers and his dad set out to see her one day and drove to the West Coast. They both quit their jobs at the shoe plant, and Rogers got a job picking fruit when they got to California. Entertainment industry calls. Rogers was a young adult with a full-time job in California by 1930. Amid the Great Depression, Rogers thought he was fortunate to have found work in the construction business. But soon his luck would change when he could go into the world of entertainment. His sister, Mary, told him to try out for a local radio show called Midnight Frolic, even though all he had done was entertain his family and friends as a child. Rogers didn't want to do it at first, but he chose to give it a try. It was a great shot. Joining a country band. After living in Inglewood, California for a year, Roy got a new chance. He could try out for a radio show. Singing and dancing in front of his family was something he'd done before, but being on a TV show was something he'd never done before. But he was more than driven than that, and he did a great job on the test. A few days later, he was even given a better offer. He could join a real country band called the Rocky Mountaineers. Humble beginnings. Rogers and his family were very happy when he got his first job, and then being asked to join a music group just a few days later, that doesn't happen very often. That being said, Rogers' chance to be on the radio show with the Rocky Mountaineers wasn't just a big deal because it was his first job in the music business. Also, this was the first thing he did to make history and become the king of the Cowboys. A bumpy road. After the Rocky Mountaineers, Rogers played with the International Cowboys, the O-Bar-O Cowboys, and Jack LaFave and his Texas Outlaws, among other well-known bands. All of these bands were good, but they were missing the one thing Rogers needed to become great. In 1934, Bob Nolan and Tim Spencer made him an offer he couldn't refuse. This was his big break. They used to be in the band Rocky Mountaineers with him, and the three of them have now chosen to form the Pioneers Trio. This was the start of a famous group that became known as the Sons of the Pioneers. The pioneers of the genre. Rogers' first few years in the business may have been rough, but he became famous faster than any other artist before or after him. Sons of the Pioneers was one of the first Western music bands, and they left a powerful mark on the music world. With their unique singing, great lyrics, and general musicianship, they changed and promoted country Western music. And quickly, what began in California spread to every part of the United States. They were one of the first country bands and are still one of the longest-running ones. Rogers' first love. Like now, there were fans and followers of music bands back then. When Rogers started making songs, he met Lucille Ascalise right away, who became a huge fan. These two people not only loved music together, but they also quickly fell in love. During his trips, she went with him and saw him make big hits. They made up their minds that they'd spend the rest of their lives together and got married in 1933. It turned out, though, that love doesn't always last. They got a divorce after 3 years of marriage and went their different ways. Another admirer. Rogers stuck with his plan to find the love of his life even after his first marriage didn't work out. He was still hoping that he'd find that special someone. Even though his first date wasn't great, doing what you love is also said to be the way to meet someone. In 1933, Rogers met another fan named Grace Arlene Wilkins while on tour in New Mexico with one of his old bands. Even though they were attracted to each other, Rogers was already married at the time. Even so, they stayed in touch and wrote each other letters every once in a while. Second chance at marriage. Rogers met up with the lovely woman from New Mexico after getting separated in 1936. There was still a spark, and since Rogers was now single, they were able to connect more deeply. They were so close that they got married the same year and began living together. Most of us would think this sounds like a Hollywood love story, but Rogers was living it. Rogers didn't want his life or hopes to end there, though. Chasing dreams. Rogers seemed to have everything by the time he was 25. He was in an innovative country music band. His wife backed his music plans. He worked in the entertainment business, and he did what he loved. Rogers used to play country music, but how did he become the king of the cowboys? In 1935, his band was so innovative that many offers came in for them to be in different kinds of movies. Rogers tried Hollywood for the first time with this, and the change would be good for him. First Hollywood appearance. After his success in singing, he went on to have another hit in movies. His friends and he were in a few movies together before they went out on their own. Due to his charm, he was able to get a few lead parts, so he changed his name to Dick Weston. Some of his first big parts were as a singer in the Wild Horse Rodeo and the Old Barn Dance. But soon, he'll have the chance of a lifetime that'll make him famous as Roy Rogers, the king of the cowboys. The story behind Roy Rogers. Rogers' rise to fame is just as interesting as the story behind his name. The name didn't come from the movie character, though. The trouble began when the people in charge of the studio wanted to give him a strong name, fit for a king. Roy is his first name, and it comes from the French word for king, roi. His last name, Rogers, comes from the name of one of the best Western stories, Will Rogers. Leonard Sly, who used to be known as Dick Weston, changed his name and became Roy Rogers, the king of the cowboys. Getting pregnant. Rogers, his wife, and their new daughter were having a wonderful time together. All good things in life seem to happen when you least expect them to. They met Cheryl Darlene 2 years ago. By that time, Rogers' business was growing quickly, and they both had the family that they'd always wanted. When they thought things couldn't get any better, they learned Wilkins was going to have another girl. Yes, fate does have strange ways of surprising us, but the couple was thrilled when they heard the news. The birth of Roy Jr. There are a lot of people who have a hard time getting pregnant. Neither medicine nor technology were as advanced in the 1940s as they are now. Rogers and Wilkins knew how hard it was to try to have a baby, but as luck would have it, they had a daughter named Lindy Lou 2 years after they adopted Cheryl Darlene. For Rogers and his family, this wasn't the end of their happy journey. A few years later, they had a baby boy named Roy Jr. Sad to say, though, sometimes good news has to come with bad news. A life for a life. Roy Rogers and Grace Wilkins were blessed with a son in the fall of 1946, but sadly, Wilkins had serious problems while he was being born. She, unfortunately, died just a few days after giving birth to their son because the circumstances were so bad. Even though Rogers was saddened over the death of his beloved wife, the driven young man found a way to get through it and get back on his feet quickly. The Western Souls. Rogers got the lead in the movie Cowboy and the Senorita in 1941. Trigger the horse, a horse that became a cowboy icon, was in this movie. Trigger and Rogers were together through good times and bad. Trigger was known as the smartest horse in movies. Despite how close they were, it was the Queen of the West, Dale Evans, who played her in the movie, who had the most important effect on his life. Evans played major roles in many of Rogers' movies, and the two became very close. The Fateful Yes. When the 1950s came around, the power pair sped through Hollywood's golden age. There was movie after movie with the Western Souls, and they were guests on a lot of talk shows, TV shows, and even rodeos. Rogers was finally ready to get married at one rodeo. He got down on one knee in front of a huge crowd at Chicago Stadium and asked Evans to marry him. Fans went crazy because it was such a famous moment. Finally taking the next step in their lives together, the Western movie stars met. Happy family of 11. They had dreams bigger than life itself when they finally got married. This wasn't just for the entertainment business either. They also wanted to add to their family. They already had 3 kids from Rogers' first marriage and 2 from Evans, so they chose to adopt 4 more. With 3 new girls and 1 new son, the family of 7 became a family of 11. Their names are Mimi, Dodie, Debbie, and Sandy. When the family had to go through a sad fight, happiness went through the roof. Enduring another tragedy. Rogers and Evans promised to be together no matter what, and they kept their promise. They had to deal with a lot of problems, but they did the best they could. The death of their daughter Robin Elizabeth was one of these terrible tragedies. After having 11 kids, the happy pair finally got pregnant and had a sweet little girl named Robin. Unfortunately, she was found to have both Down syndrome and mumps, and she died before she was 2 years old because of her health problems. Far From a Millionaire. What an amazing person Rogers was to keep going even when things got tough. No matter what was going on behind the scenes, he always had a good mood and a smile on his face. He worked hard to get to the top of Hollywood and left a permanent mark on both Western music and movies. He came from nothing. When he first started working in movies in 1938, he was only making $500 a month. He joked at the 1983 Golden Boot Awards, "I was making $75 a week, each week. I've heard that these guys are stopping these shows because they only make $35,000 a year. I want to throw up." A living Hall of Fame legend. Roy Rogers used to make a lot less than $100 a week. Motion Picture Herald's list of the top 10 money-making Western stars put Rogers on the list more than once. Besides this, he kept getting awards, like the commemorative medallion. He was also a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1988. Even though he had a good life, he's rich in ways other than having won prizes and getting well paid. Wealth comes from within. Rogers is truly valuable to those who know and love him because of his kind heart and personality. He had the morals of a cowboy and lived by the truth, honor, and kindness. He had a great sense of humor, and his good mood could make the whole room shine. He always smiled in all of his public shots. His friendly personality was what made Roy Rogers so successful. This, along with his many other skills, is what makes him a beloved star and the King of the West. Rogers was always an example for many people who wanted to be artists. Not many people jumped to such great heights and took all the chances that came their way. A Keen Cowboy. You could say Rogers was charming and funny, but he wasn't stupid. The actor made sure he owned the rights to his stage name, face, and lovely voice so he could sell merchandise in the 1940s. That was a very smart choice because he went on to do many successful businesses, such as writing and selling comic books, clothes, fun items, toys, running a restaurant company, and more. Rogers' Last Wish. The museum was open for 50 years before things went wrong. It was first put there in Apple Valley, California, and while Rogers and Evans were still alive, it worked well. But because of costs, the museum had to be moved to Branson, Missouri, after they died. Sadly, this new site didn't bring in enough money, and the museum had more problems for 6 years before someone made a choice. Since the economy was bad, the museum closed for good in 2010. The collection was sold on an auction led by Roy Jr. and made approximately $2.9 million. Rogers' son had an emotional moment, but later he said that Roy Rogers explicitly asked that the museum be closed if it became too much to handle. A long-lasting legacy. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans were about to have the best ride of their lives. They enjoyed every moment with their big family, full of love, happiness, and desire. They got through hard times by holding hands and staying together until death broke them apart. To make things even more sad and beautiful, they both died of the same illness. Roy Rogers died in 1998 of severe heart failure, and Dale Evans died of the same thing in 2001. Even though they're no longer with us, their memory lives on through their love.